was the editor of The Nation, which was the newspaper of the Young Ireland movement, which was active in the 1840s. And as the name implies, they believed in the idea of a single Irish nation regardless of religion or background. Davis, incidentally, was Church of Ireland Protestant, like Tone. But they were also interested in Irish culture, language, music, literature, and this was part of a wider European democratic and cultural revival. And in 1848, there were a whole series of revolutions in Europe inspired by this type of movement. And there was also an attempted revolution in Ireland, led by the Young Ireland movement, but on a very small scale, nothing like 1798, more of a skirmish really than a revolution, which is not surprising because the people were in no physical condition to have a revolution, because this was in the middle of the potato famine, which broke out in 1845, triggered off by potato blight. This was a fungus that made the potatoes rot in the ground. This was a new disease never before experienced. Now, the potato originally came from South America. It was brought to Europe by Sir Walter Raleigh, along with tobacco. But the irony is the potato became popular in Ireland as a protection against famine. In other words, as a reliable substitute for grain crops, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and so on. The problem with grain is the Irish climate. It's too wet, there's not enough sunshine. So there was always the possibility of bad weather, crop failure, and sometimes famine. The potato, on the other hand, was ideally suited to Irish conditions, and until this new fungus came along, it was never known to fail. It was also by far the most productive crop. Before the famine, they were getting about 6 tons to the acre in terms of yields. That's massive. Just as well though, because before the famine, the average Irish peasant was eating up to 14 pounds of potatoes per day. That's about 6.5 kilos of potatoes per day. That's a colossal amount. But they ate nothing else, potatoes and buttermilk. It's actually quite a good diet, in fact, nutritionally. Deadly boring, but it's adequate. The other advantage of the potato was that it was so productive that it was possible and feasible for the poorer peasants on the margins to subdivide their land amongst all their children. But then if the next generation divided that land amongst their children and so on, pretty soon you'd whole families eking out an existence on maybe 1 or 2 acres of potato ground. And of course the result was population explosion from under 2 million in the 1740s to over 8 million by the 1840s. So that's a quadrupling of population in 1 century. Now the population of Britain trebled over the same period, but that was at the height of the Industrial Revolution. But Ireland didn't have the raw materials, the coal or the iron. Then the more that Britain industrialised, the more that Ireland de-industrialised, to go back to your point. Cheap machine-produced goods flooded the Irish market, and the Act of Union, by creating a single economic zone, accelerated that process. So this population increase was unsustainable, and eventually disaster struck with the arrival of this fungus. So in 1845, 46, 47, 48, 49, there were complete failures of the potato. 1 million people died of starvation or disease. In fact, disease was the big killer. Typhus, relapsing fever. That was spread by body lice. And of course the thing was, once the famine hit, the whole nation was on the move. People were being evicted, people were going to the workhouse, people were going to the emigrant ship, and they were bringing this disease with them. Within 10 years, another 2 million people had disappeared due to emigration. And in the century that followed, half of the Irish people born ended up somewhere else, 2/3 of them in the United States. That decline in population didn't bottom out until the 1960s. By then we were down to about 4 million people. We're now back up to about 6 million people, 1.5 million in the north, 4.5 million in the south. So we've never recovered our pre-famine population of 8.25 million. Now, I know of no other nation on the planet whose population today is less than it was 150 years ago. But the famine is a very controversial subject, because while these people starved, Ireland continued not only to produce but also to export food. No embargo was placed on exports because the London government stuck rigidly to a laissez-faire, free trade, free market economic policy. That was justified in the name of providence, the will of God, or even that this was somehow the judgment of God on the Irish people. So it was a very Victorian combination of economic and religious dogma that was the problem here. That's what people died of. This was not a natural disaster.
So they exported the grain?
Yeah, it was like two different economies. You had a potato-based subsistence economy, and you had a large farm commercial sector, and it was business as usual in the latter. But the famine had far-reaching consequences. The obvious one was the halving of the population. It also led to a big decline in the Irish language, because most of those who died or who emigrated were the poorer Gaelic-speaking half of society. And then emigration almost killed the language completely, because knowledge of English was your meal ticket if you were planning life in America, Australia, or Britain itself. So quite often parents who might speak Irish to each other would speak only English to their children, and they thought they were doing them a big favour by preparing them for emigration. Thirdly, the famine and its aftermath completely transformed attitudes to religion, sex, and marriage. Now, up until about a generation ago, we Irish were famous, if not notorious, for our deep, deep sense of Catholic sexual guilt. We were all racked by it. And if you're at all familiar with Irish literature, it's there in spades. Whether it be James Joyce, the books of Ed O'Brien, Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, there's a classic of the miserable childhood, the repressive church, the continuous reign. Jesus, what a head wreck. Anyway, fortunately, in more recent years, we've overcome these taboos. So if you're taking a wander down to Temple Bar tonight, be careful. Times have changed. The interesting thing is, though, if you go back to pre-famine Irish society, and if you consider this teeming, rapidly increasing population, well, on the face of it, there's no evidence of Catholic sexual guilt there. You know, they're kind of breeding like rabbits. And the basis for this teeming society was the practice of land subdivision. Because right down to the bottom of the social pyramid, land was being parcelled into just small bits, if you like, that a relatively large cross-section of people had access to it. And might only be 1 or 2 acres, but that gave you the capacity to feed a family. You're then in the marriage market. You can marry whoever you like, whenever you like. Now, this all changed with the famine, because there was a collective realization that this dividing up of land had led to disaster. So that stopped. And then the opposite became the trend, the consolidation of land into larger, more viable holdings. But of course, larger holdings meant fewer holdings. So this automatically narrowed the marriage market, because now in a typical farming family, only the eldest son, who inherited the entire farm, only he would be in an economic position to marry. But the poor fella might be well into middle age before he got the chance, because he had to wait until both his parents had passed away, especially his widowed mother, because the widowed mother, while she was alive, would under no circumstances sanction a marriage of her eldest son, which would then bring a rival female into the household and cause all sorts of problems. And of course the son, for his part, if he's a typical easygoing Irish farmer with the mother cooking his food, darning his socks, why bother with the hassle of marriage? And by the way, did you know that Jesus was Irish? He up to speed. Jesus was definitely Irish, very strong evidence. Lived at home with his mother until he was 30. She thought he was God, and he thought she was a virgin. Anyway, before I'm struck down. So when this middle-aged guy got the chance to marry, he would need to pass on the land, so he would have to have an heir. So he'd marry a woman maybe 20, 30 years his junior. So then when he died, he left behind a relatively young widow, who then blocked the path to the next eldest son, and so on, generation after generation, perpetuating a pattern of delayed marriage and of a big gap in age at marriage. And we can be pretty sure that these were not love matches. Increasingly, these were arranged marriages, so the whole nature of marriage changed. Now, next question, what happened to the rest of the family who didn't have access to land? What were their options? Well, number one, emigration. So, and as I said, half of those born were forced to emigrate. Now, unique to Ireland is the fact that more women than men left Ireland. Usually it's the other way around. Anyone speculate why? Exactly, because if you stayed in Ireland, you'd end up married to an old man, and this would be brokered over your head. So they went to America. Second choice was people joined the clergy. People became priests and nuns in huge numbers, either from religious conviction or as a career option. Third choice was you stayed at home, unmarried, and you went insane. Seriously, the rate of mental illness in Ireland quadrupled in the years after the famine. And this is linked to the unusually low rate of marriage. Marriage was postponed for so long that over a quarter missed the boat completely and never got the chance to marry, with the consequent isolation, loneliness, and sexual frustration of their situation. Although I'm making a big assumption there, I'm assuming that unmarried people don't have a sex life. Let's look at that. Because what I've suggested is that you had this free and easy marriage market before the famine. Along comes the famine, the marriage market collapses. Now, people's human nature, their biological impulses, we can assume, would remain constant. So you might expect that after the famine, if there's a restricted marriage market, there would be more sex outside marriage. You following the argument? Mm-hmm. Now, in a pre-contraceptive age, that can be easily measured by looking at the rate of illegitimacy. In other words, the more sex you have outside marriage, the more births you will have outside marriage. And that's simply a matter of going to the birth certificates and totting up the figures. The problem is when they did the research, they found that in the century after the famine, the Irish rate of illegitimacy didn't go up, it went down. Didn't go down marginally, it went down by 50%. So we can only draw one conclusion from that, which is not only are over a quarter of adults unmarried, but the bulk of them must be celibate, because if they were sexually active, the rate of illegitimacy would have been going up. It's absolutely clear cut. Now, that makes no sense. It's counterintuitive until you factor in the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, partly this was simple arithmetic. Post-famine, the Catholic Church had more clergy ministering to much fewer people. So they were able to keep an eye on everybody, make sure the moral code was upheld. Not necessarily for themselves, of course, but for everybody else. But on top of that, the Catholic Church could provide the moral framework to police this restricted marriage market. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that the people themselves embraced Catholic social teaching, Catholic sexual guilt, if you like, because it literally made virtue of their necessity. Because if you're facing into a life with little or no marriage prospects, or even of a sex life, well, I mean, that you wanted to hear the priest elevate your virginal status onto a pedestal and denounce the evils of vice, corruption, fornication and sin, because it was the only comfort you were going to get. And the profile created of a high rate of immigration, a high rate of recruitment to the Catholic clergy, and an unusually low rate of marriage, that persisted right up to the 1960s. So it's only since then that the demography has changed. By then, we had become a more urban, more industrialized society, and like everywhere else, we were becoming a more secular society. Mass communication, travel, television opened up people's view of the world. As one conservative politician here famously lamented, he said there was no sex in Ireland until television. I was born before television, actually. I was a miracle birth. And of course, more